Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for January 23rd, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. Our texts for today are Genesis 24. Then we have the last chapter of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 13. And then we also have Acts 23 and Matthew 23. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. First, in Genesis 24, this is one of my, I think, one of the most beautiful stories in the book of Genesis. It's the story of Abraham finding a wife for his son Isaac. A couple of things to note about this story. First of all, this is part of Abraham's what we would call death story. And if you don't know, this is kind of what I spent a majority of my PhD dissertation looking at, was the death stories of the Old Testament, looking at how these stories are structured and what we can learn about them, what we can learn about the Hebrew theology of death, even from these types of stories. And so I spent a couple of years studying and writing about death in the ancient world, and particularly in the Hebrew Bible. So that was quite the experience for me. In fact, it earned me the rather unfortunate nickname Dr. Death for a little while. But in Genesis 24, we have the story of Abraham's death, and typically in death stories in the ancient in the Old Testament, what you have is an announcement of impending death, usually by the narrator, and then it's followed by a story that shows the individual, or even a speech showing the individual putting his house in order. In this case, the announcement of impending death is in Genesis 24:1. Abraham was old and advanced in years, and God had blessed him in all things. So anytime a narrator says somebody is old and advanced in years, it's probably pointing to the fact that the individual is going to be dying soon in the text. And so what does Abraham do? But he provides for a way for the promised blessings to be passed on. Isaac has not found a bride yet, and so Abraham sends his most trusted servant to find this bride for his son Isaac. It was the most important thing he could do to set his house in order. And it's a beautiful story. One of the things that impresses me about the story is just how much prayer is kind of at the center of the story, as Eliezer prays that God will lead him in the right way to ultimately to Rebecca. And also God's providential hand is upon it throughout as well. And you can see that God is working to preserve the promise given to Abraham. The other thing that really impresses me about the story is the character of Rebecca. At the end of the story, you see here's this woman who gets a message from God through this servant to leave the land of her childhood and go with this man to a land that she does not know. And that probably should sound familiar, because that's exactly what Abraham himself did. So Rebecca almost becomes this Abraham-like figure in the story, a very admirable character, I guess you could say. So love that story in Genesis 24. In fact, I think next time I preach a wedding sermon, I might preach from Genesis 24. It's just a neat text. Moving on to Nehemiah 13. Here we have one of the last texts in historically speaking in the Bible or in the Old Testament. Before we get to the end of the Old Testament period, this is probably the last historical event that we have in the historical books before we get to the Old Testament period, into the Old Testament period. Esther happens before this. You could probably say Malachi deals with some situations in Israel that are at least at the same time as this, or perhaps a little bit later than what we find in Nehemiah. But what we find here is probably the last historical records we have of, at least in the Old Testament, of this end of the Old Testament period. And of course, what strikes you as you read through Nehemiah 13 is all the problems that are still facing the Israelites. They haven't been caring for the priests and for the temple. They've allowed uncleanness to enter into the temple. They're still having trouble with intermarriage and this idea of holiness, separating themselves out from the paganism that surrounds them. And it seems like they really haven't learned much, even through all the exile, even through all the difficulties that they have been through, the judgment from God. And so the Old Testament is ending, and we'll see this somewhat in Malachi as well, on a cliffhanger. There's this sense of it's not fixed yet. We need something else. We're looking for something else, and of course, that something else is the Messiah, the King who will come and make all things right and bring in righteousness. Moving on to Matthew, we see Jesus still teaching during this time during Holy Week, and in Matthew he's especially targeting the Pharisees in Matthew 23, and he is especially targeting their hypocrisy. Once again, it strikes me how much Jesus's teaching is really similar to the prophets, particularly Jeremiah, who targeted the very same thing some 600 years prior, the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders at the time of the exile, and now Jesus is targeting that same thing. How would we apply a text like that to ourselves? Well, I had a great friend from seminary who one time preached a series on the Pharisees, and I think that would be a good series for us to do at some point as well, because when I look at the Pharisees, I see some of the same tendencies within myself. We all have those Pharisaical types of tendencies, and it's something to guard against. And I think we can read a text like this, and God can use it as a sanctifying tool in our life to say, avoid these types of things, avoid this hypocrisy, avoid and go after the righteousness and the justice and the key characteristics of the covenantal community of faith that God is looking for. Don't be worried about outside righteousness. Be worried about what God is doing within you through the work of His Spirit, and through the sanctifying work of the Word itself, the washing of the water of the Word, to sanctify us into a people of God that doesn't have that kind of hypocrisy. That's something that obviously God is concerned about in His people. Interestingly enough, when we get to the book of Acts, Paul is on trial, and he's brought before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling body. And when he's brought on trial before them, he confronts the high priest at the time in the same way Jesus confronts the Pharisees, targeting his hypocrisy as well. And Paul avoids a plot against his life as well, and he's eventually brought to Caesarea to escape this plot against his life. And there he's going to be brought before the governor, and we'll read about that story in chapter 24. But some interesting connections between Matthew 23 and Acts 23. So I hope this has been a nice little study into these great texts. And just as a closing thought, I would just encourage you to use this text, especially Matthew 23, to use this text to kind of do some self-examination and pray that God would lead you in the path of righteousness, and that the scriptures would illumine that path for you this day, January 23rd, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.